Ezekiel 33:3.
Welcome to today's Sabbath study. Today we're going to be studying the worship of the sun god Baal. Baal comes up a lot in the Old Testament, and then he kind of just disappears in the New Testament. So people haven't been really able to track him. So what we're going to do is we're going to take a look at the history of sun worship in the Bible. We'll look at the very earliest verses. We'll try to kind of pinpoint who started it or who influenced it and where it kind of traveled. So the first question we have to ask ourselves is, did Israel worship the god Baal? Look no further than the book of Judges chapter 10, verse 6. And again, the Israelites did evil in the sight of the Lord. They served the Baals, the Ashtoreths, the gods of Aram, Sidon, Moab, and the gods of the Ammonites and the Philistines. Thus they forsook the Lord and did not serve him. So here you can tell in Judges, if you ever had a question, is it okay to serve other gods? Well, if you take a look at Judges 10:6, it's seen as evil. So when you worship a different god aside from the God of the Bible, it's seen as evil. There's no other reason for it. And you can see here that there's multiple gods listed. Baals, Ashtoreths. We don't get the name of the god of Aram or Sidon or Moab. We also don't get the name of the god of the Ammonites or the Philistines. So there's the potential here that it could be 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7 different gods, possibly. In Judges 10:6, Israel is accused of following the gods of 7 other nations. So if you're ever under the pretense that Israel had worshiped the same God throughout the Old and New Testament, you're very much confused. They have been worshiping all kinds of different gods in their area. That's why today, when it comes to Christianity and Judaism, you have to pull apart the stuff that's not supposed to be in there, because of course, when you can see how often Israel would go to worship different gods, the customs and traditions from the other nations got it meshed together with their own. Even the kings of Israel followed after foreign gods. So it wasn't like it was just the people. And obviously the king is supposed to set the precedent for the rest of the kingdom. In 1 Kings 11:7, at that time on a hill east of Jerusalem, Solomon built a high place for Shamash, the abomination of Moab, and for Moloch, the abomination of the Ammonites. Okay, so we have 2 gods listed here, and we saw a couple verses back that Israel was worshiping both the god of Moab and the god of the Ammonites, and we see 2 gods here. So we know that Israel at one point in time was worshiping Shamash, and Israel at one point in time was worshiping Moloch. And we can see King Solomon was the king that was actually worshiping both here. And pay very special attention to the details. It says, at that time on the east of Jerusalem. They're telling you the direction. The direction is important. If we're dealing with cardinal points, we know that east is where the sun rises. And so here we see Solomon building a high place for Shamash and Moloch, but we don't know what they are. 1 Kings 11:5, just a couple verses before. Solomon followed Ashtoreth, the goddess of the Sidonians, and Moloch, the abomination of the Ammonites. Okay, so we already knew about Moloch, but we have a new name now. Couple of verses before that, we can see Solomon wasn't just following a god, Solomon was also following a goddess. So this king of Israel, the second to King David, well, the son of King David, he followed both gods and goddesses. And Solomon was supposed to be the wisest man in the world. It was said in the Bible that there'd be never a man as wise as Solomon. Notice though, when we take a look, Ashtoreth is from the Sidonians. So if we go back just a little bit here, and we take a look at the book of Judges, we can see in Judges, they serve the Baals, the Ashtaroths, and here we can see Sidon. So Sidon right there, we can overlap this obviously with 1 Kings 11:5. So they were following Ashtoreth, they were following Moloch, they were following Shamash. Israel was not being loyal to their God. They followed an abundance of different gods, and it was something that plagued them through their whole history. Some of the gods Israel followed in the Tanakh. Remember, Tanakh is the Old Testament. This is in the Tanakh, we saw the worship of Baal, Shamash, Moloch, Ashtaroth, the Queen of Heaven, Asherah. There's actually more names than that, but that's just a couple to get you started. So just once again, if you start noticing that there's differences in Christianity or differences in Judaism, keep in mind, look how many different deities people were worshiping in the past. It's possible what they were doing was they were mixing some of what they grew up with and then mixed it with the worship of Ashtoreth, or some of what they grew up with and then mixed it with the worship of Shamash. Following foreign gods was a very heavy offense in the Bible. As a matter of fact, when we deal with the 10 Commandments, if we look at the first commandment deals directly with this. So if you're trying to figure out what's the most important thing to God, should I not kill? Should I not steal? Should I not? Well, you shouldn't do any of those things. But if we prioritize them, one being the most important, well, the first commandment was have no other gods before me. So there was obviously something imperative to your salvation having to do with not following other gods, either consciously or unconsciously. Deuteronomy 29:14-19 speaks about this. This is Moses speaking when he says, I am making this covenant and this oath not only with you, but also with those who are standing here with us today in the presence of the Lord our God, as well as those who are not here today. Okay, so remember, Moses took the people out of Egypt. They were in the wilderness, and then eventually they make it to the promised land. Moses never sees the promised land, so we know that this conversation Moses is having is in the wilderness. So the people are in the wilderness with Moses, and he's speaking to the people that are presently there, plus he's talking about descendants to come. So that's why he says, as well as those who are not with us today. He's talking about future generations. So I'm going to make an agreement. You're going to make an oath with your God for future generations. So what is it? Well, it says here, for you yourselves know how we lived in the land of Egypt and how we passed through the nations on the way here. You saw the abominations and idols among them of wood and stone and silver and gold. Okay, so we can already tell where the oath is going here. We know that the oath is being made after they left Egypt. Moses is reminding them that they had just passed through Egypt. And what did they see in Egypt? Abominations, idols made out of wood, stone, silver, and gold. So we can already tell here in Deuteronomy, if you're dealing with some kind of a religion from Egypt, you already know that you are in opposition with the God of the Bible. If you find any of your traditions linking to Egypt, automatically you are in opposition with the God of the Bible. Now watch this. Deuteronomy 29:13-19. Make sure there is no man or woman, clan or tribeman among you whose heart turns away from the Lord our God and goes to worship the gods of those nations. Which nations are we talking about? We're talking about Egypt. Make sure there's no one among you that goes towards those nations. Make sure there is no root among you that bears such a poisonous and bitter fruit. So the worship of the gods of Egypt was seen as a very, very profane thing. Because when such a person hears the words of this oath, he is invoking a blessing on himself, saying, I will have peace, even though I walk in the stubbornness of my own heart. This will bring disaster on the watered land as well as the dry. What this statement is saying here is you need to cut away from all the individuals that are within Israel that are saying to themselves that they can carry on worshiping the way that they want to, the way that their heart desires, and still thinking they'll have peace from their God. Basically, this covenant right here is promising you that if you carry on with these practices, you will see your own destruction. In Deuteronomy 29:20, it says, the Lord will never be willing to forgive him. Instead, his anger and jealousy will burn against that man, and every curse written in the book will fall upon him. The Lord will blot out his name from under heaven and single him out from all the tribes of Israel for disaster, according to all the curses of the covenant written in this book of the law. Okay, so here's the deal. Worship other gods, and what happens? Destruction. We can see your name's blotted out from under heaven. So it's a really big deal. That's why the first commandment, have no other gods before me. Don't dabble with that one. Don't mess around with that one, because that one's the most important. You can see right here, it says, instead in his jealousy, we can see the Lord is jealous. In other words, if there are other gods, false gods, trying to take worship away, he will get jealous, he will get angry, and he will react. But he gives this testament to all of the people through Moses in Deuteronomy, so you would know, and not just you, your future generations would know, that the Lord would set his face against you if you went and worshiped other gods aside from him. Exodus 21:3. And God spoke all these words, I am the Lord your God who brought you out of Egypt, out of the land of slavery. You shall have no other gods before me. So look at the very first statement. I brought you out of where? I brought you out of Egypt. And what's the very next thing after I brought you out of Egypt? Have no other gods before me. Clearly there were other gods in Egypt. We saw when they came out of Egypt, there was the golden calf. We saw this in Exodus 32:4. Where did the golden calf come from? Because it's nowhere in Genesis. It's not a symbol of God that we see with Jacob or Isaac or Abraham building an altar. We can see in Egypt there was a calf. Its name was Apis. Apis was the son of Hathor. And if you take a look, you can see this hieroglyphic. You'll see it's a bull, and on top of the bull's head, you've got this sun sitting in between the two horns. But this wasn't the only bull that was worshipped in Egypt. Egypt had several dynasties. The bull, which was Apis, had a mother, and the mother was called Hathor. And Hathor we can see on the right-hand side. So we see Apis on the left, we see Hathor on the right, and again, you can see Hathor in the center, and you can see she has these bird-looking wings. And just like her son Apis, she has the crescent moon, and then she has the sun sitting between the crescent moon. Hathor was also known as Isis. So the Egyptians had several dynasties, and then over the dynasties, some of their god and goddess names changed. So Hathor was an ancient Egyptian goddess associated with the later Isis. So Isis is the newer name. Isis is the name that you hear people saying today, which was the newer name for Hathor. And there was another name as well, was Sekhmet. Sekhmet is spelled Sekhmet. These are all actually the same goddess. So whether the Egyptians went by the name Hathor or Isis or Sekhmet, they were all referring to the same thing. And it says here, she's the primeval goddess from whom all others were derived. So the Egyptians seem to have the depiction that every goddess you would see in the ancient world was just another depiction of this one goddess, Isis. Isis was known as the Lady of 10,000 names. So when we go through the Bible and we see names like Astarte or Asherah, who is Asherah in the book of Jeremiah? It's actually the goddess Isis. The Jews followed Egyptian gods after residing there for 400 years. So the Jews were in Egypt for 400 years. If you know the story of Genesis, in Genesis 15:13, Abraham is told ahead of time this would happen. God said to Abram, this is before he was Abraham, know for certain that your descendants will be strangers in a land that is not theirs, where they will be enslaved and oppressed for 400 years. So before Moses was even born, before his mother was even conceived, here's Abraham already hearing, your ancestors, your descendants, they're going to be enslaved in Egypt for 400 years. It didn't tell them what land, though. If we take a look at Abraham, this is the line we're going to focus on today. So if we come from Abraham, then we go through Sarah. Sarah and Abraham have a child called Isaac. Isaac has a wife, Rebekah. Rebekah and Isaac have a child called Jacob as well as Esau. We're only focusing on Jacob today because we're going to take a look at Leah. Leah was the older sister. And then we're going to take a look at Levi. Levi was the third son born to Leah, and Leah was Jacob's first wife. Exodus 6:14. Now Joseph and all his brothers and all that generation died. So right here, what we're reading about is we're reading about the end details of Genesis. So when you follow Genesis through, you see there's Abraham and there's Isaac and then there's Jacob, and then Jacob lives within this land of Israel. But then eventually what happens is later in the book of Genesis, they leave Israel, they leave the land of Canaan, and they go back to Egypt. And they go back to Egypt because there's a famine. And now we're seeing in Exodus 14, this is obviously years after the famine has ended, but the family's still living in Egypt. And so now it starts off saying, now Joseph and all of his brothers of that generation died. So the previous generation that knew the Pharaoh at that time, they're all gone. But the Israelites were exceedingly fruitful. So in other words, they kept living in Egypt and they kept expanding. They multiplied greatly, increased in numbers, and became so numerous that the land was filled with them. Then a new king, to whom Joseph meant nothing, came to power in Egypt. So Joseph was friends with the old Pharaoh. As a matter of fact, he got the old Pharaoh all this wealth and all this power. The Pharaoh wouldn't have been nearly as powerful as he was if it wasn't for Joseph living in his land. But now Joseph is dead, and Joseph was from the tribes of Israel. So now we have Israelites living in Egypt, but they have no friends there, and they have a lot of property, a lot of things. Yeah, if you've ever heard of Joseph in the Technicolor Dreamcoat, that's the same Joseph. So look, he said to his people, the Israelites have become far too numerous for us. Come, we must deal shrewdly with them, or they will become even more numerous. And if war breaks out, they will join our enemies, fight against us, and leave the country. So they put slave masters over them to oppress them with forced labor. And they built Pithom and Ramesses and store cities for the Pharaoh. So if you take a look here, you can see that it starts off where, okay, our past relatives have died. We don't know anyone who's lived in the land. We're still multiplying and increasing in all of our wealth. And the people that are native to Egypt are obviously getting upset because we're doing quite well. You'll notice that any place where the people went, like the God's chosen people, they would be blessed and they would have more wealth, unless, of course, they were disobeying their God. So every land that they would go into, we saw this with the Canaanites. We saw this actually with the king of Shechem. When we did our Bible studies on Wednesdays, we just recently studied the king of Shechem. He approached Isaac, and then he made a pact with Isaac because Isaac was becoming too powerful. And we saw the same thing happening with Abraham. So basically, as the Israelites would grow in power, whatever nation they were living in, since it wasn't their nation, the people who were native to that land would get very, very tense, because it looks like these people are eventually going to have so much wealth, they'll just take this country from us, they'll take it over. So this is what's going on in Egypt, and this is the point where the Pharaoh decides, all right, we'll enslave them. So we'll force them into labor, and then here we can see that they built 2 Egyptian cities. So it says nothing about the building of the pyramids. If you think the Jews built the pyramids, that is not true. The pyramids were there long before the Jews were actually ever there. So we can see Pithom and Ramesses. These were actually built by the Jews while they were in forced labor for 400 years, or over a 400-year period. Now we're going to compare this. If you just read Exodus in the New Testament, any translation, it's not going to make a difference. You are not going to see the 3rd city. There is 1 city missing from Exodus 2:11. It says, I'll read it again. So they put slave masters over them to oppress them with forced labor, and they built Pithom and Ramses as store cities for the Pharaoh. Down below, you'll see the Greek Septuagint. I've highlighted the words that you can see up top. So the first word in Greek is for Pithom. The second word is for Ramses. Now you have a third word, and that third word is missing from Exodus 2:11 in the regular translation. So you will only be able to find the 3rd city specifically if you read the Greek Bible. 1 city is missing when you compare the Torah to the Greek Septuagint. And remember, the Greek Septuagint is just basically taking the Old Testament and writing in Greek. You have to remember that during the times of Christ, everyone spoke Greek. So if they couldn't read the Torah in Hebrew, what they would do is they would just rewrite it over in Greek, and that's the Septuagint. If we take a look, we can see Pithom is there, Ramses is there, but the one that is missing is the city of On. It's also known as Heliopolis. And then we can see our omega symbol. So when we read the book of Genesis, we'll find that when the Israelites moved into Egypt during the famine near the end of the book of Genesis, they moved into this area called the land of Goshen. So if you look in Lower Egypt, you can see where it says Goshen on the map. So this is where Jacob had lived up until the point that he died, and then they took his body and they brought it back into Canaan, and then they buried him in the place of his forefathers. But if you take a look, I put 3 arrows on the screen. I've got 1 arrow at Ramses. I've got 1 arrow at Pithom. I've got 1 arrow at Heliopolis. So these are the 3 cities that were built by the Jews. And if you take a look to the left of Heliopolis, you can see Giza. Giza is where the pyramids were. So we have no record of the Jews ever building the pyramids. The pyramids were there before them, but you can tell that Heliopolis was very close to where the Great Pyramid of Giza is. This book is written in 1794. It's called Observations upon the Plagues Inflicted upon the Egyptians by Jacob Bryant. It says on page 215, the term On among the Egyptians signifies the sun. Hence, the city of On of Egypt was uniformly rendered Heliopolis, or the city of the sun. Okay, so the Jews had built Heliopolis. Sun worship is something that we're studying from the Bible. And now we can see that the place called Heliopolis is actually the city of the sun, and we know the Jews lived there, and we knew the Jews built it. So if we start to see the Jews worshiping the sun in future chapters of the Bible, this would be a pretty good idea in regards to where they got it from. So when you look at the golden calf, for example, maybe we can see that the golden calf has something to do with what they learned in Heliopolis. On page 216, it says, among the Egyptians in those times and afterwards was applied to Helios, the same as Osiris, the sun. Now we're starting to get somewhere. So Heliopolis obviously gets its name from Helios. And Helios is a sun god. Do we see Helios much, much, much later in time? Absolutely. In the times of Christ, we've got gods like Helios, we've got Apollo, we've got Sol, we've got Mithra. When we were studying Christmas, we saw all these names come up. These are the sun gods. And we can see that Helios is equated as Osiris. So we can look at the Egyptian religion and we can see that obviously the sun is a very prominent object because the sun is obviously a symbol of their god. It says, I have mentioned it to be of my opinion that this term was denoted originally the living God. So again, they look at the sun as a symbol of the living God. And some of the names we've seen are Osiris, we've seen Helios, and obviously Helios is where we get the name Heliopolis. But the true name of the luminary, both among the ancient and the modern Egyptians, was Ra. So if you heard of the sun god Ra, well, Ra was Helios and Ra was Osiris. And so we can see the sun worship that was going on in the Old Testament all the way back in Heliopolis, which was in the days of Moses. They were worshiping the Egyptian god Ra back then. In Exodus 1:11, we can see Israelites built the city of On, the city of the sun, Heliopolis. I'll give you one other name for the city. The city is also known as the Pillar City or the City of the Pillar. Heliopolis, ancient Egypt. As a matter of fact, if you take a look on the right-hand side, you can see the Al-Masala obelisk. It's the largest surviving monument from Heliopolis. Now, this is a pillar. This is an obelisk. You can see this in London. You can see this in Washington, D.C., and you can also see this in the Vatican. So here's some points from the article on Heliopolis. It says the major surviving remnant of Heliopolis is the obelisk of the temple of Ra Atum, erected by Senseret in the 12th dynasty. The city also appears in the Old Kingdom pyramid text as the House of Ra. So we can clearly tell Heliopolis, the chief god, was clearly Ra. There might have been other names for him, such as Helios, but Helios and Ra are the same thing. Helios, the personified and deified form of the sun, was identified by the Greeks with the native Egyptian gods Ra and Atum, whose principle was located in the city. So we know, how did the world go? We know that it went from Babylon. After Babylon came Persia. After Persia came Greece, and then came Rome. Well, here we can see that the Greeks had picked up gods that came right from Egypt. So when we look at the idea of the Greeks and the Greeks' god Helios, we can see they pulled that all the way back from Egypt. During the Amarna period of the 18th dynasty, Pharaoh Akhenaten introduced a kind of henotheistic worship of Aten, the deified solar disk. Okay, so now they've deified the sun and they've called it Aten. As part of his construction projects, he built a Heliopolitan temple named Elevating Aten, whose stones can still be seen in some of the gates of Cairo's medieval city wall. The cult of Menivis, the bull, another embodiment of the sun, had its altar there as well. The bull's formal burial ground was situated north of the city. Okay, so we had Apis the bull, but now we've got another bull, Menivis the bull. And we can see that this bull is actually a symbol for the sun. So if we look at the golden calf, or we look at Apis, or we look at Menivis, what are we doing? We're just showing different ways of displaying the sun without showing the sun. So here's Menivis. We look at Menivis, it is the exact same thing that we saw when we saw Apis. We see a bull and we see a sun in between its two horns. So two different names, identical deity. And remember, this is the son of Hathor. Hathor is Isis. So Isis is the mother, this is the child, and this is Ra. So when we look at the golden calf influence most likely came from Heliopolis, considering that the Jews built it, which is the city the Israelites built, and this is associated to Apis and Menivis, and we know that this cow symbolism was actually pointing back to Ra, at least if it was masculine. The bull and Hathor. The Menivis bull was entitled to 2 concubines, more precisely 2 cows, representing Hathor and Iset. We already know that Hathor was Isis. So if we look at the right-hand side here, whether we look at Hathor, we look at Isis, we're always going to see those 2 prongs, right, like bull horns on top of her head, and then we can see the sun in between those 2 horns. Isis was also known as the Queen of Heaven. Isis, a very ancient sky goddess and the Queen of Heaven. We see her in the book of Jeremiah 44:15. This is not a goddess you want to worship. Then all the men knew that their wives were burning incense to other gods, and all the women standing by, a great assembly, along, and look at this, along with what? all the people living in the land of Egypt. So we see here in Pathros said to Jeremiah, as for the word you have spoken to us in the name of the Lord, we will not listen to you. Instead, we will do everything we vowed to do. We will burn incense to the Queen of Heaven and offer drink offerings to her, just as we, our fathers, our kings, and our officials did in the cities of Judah and in the streets of Jerusalem. So where did they get the Queen of Heaven from? Was this an Israelite deity? Was this the mother of God? Absolutely not. Was this the wife of God? No, this was an Egyptian deity. Again, if you look at the top of Jeremiah, it says, along with all the people living in the land of Egypt. So we know the Queen of Heaven came from Egypt. And since Isis is known as the Queen of Heaven, we know that since they already grabbed the golden calf, it would only make sense that they grabbed Isis too, because the two went together. That's mother and child. Egypt is where the worship of the sun started for the Israelites. It continued through the entire Old Testament. So actually, if you go back, right, remember, we're looking at Exodus. Exodus is when we're seeing that the Jews are in Egypt for 400 years. So what were they doing before that? Well, if you sat in for our Bible studies, we're at what? Genesis chapter 31 or 30 right now. We're up to Genesis chapter 30. We have no explanation whatsoever for any other gods aside from El Shaddai, Elohim, Eloah, and El is another name that we pulled out. And another name that we pulled out was Yahweh from Genesis 4:26. Those are the only names of gods that we have in the Bible up until this point. So this golden calf thing, brand new, and we didn't see anything like it until they came out of Egypt. So Israel learned this practice in Egypt and continued to follow the gods of Heliopolis, which is where Israel adopted the golden calf worship of Apis, Menevis, and the worship of the Queen of Heaven, which was the Egyptian Isis, Hathor, the mother of Apis. The golden calf was the representation of Ra, the sun god. So here's a picture. This is of where they think monotheism started from, or at least sun worship, because sun worship and monotheism go hand in hand. This is Akhenaten. And so you can see here in the middle, that's the sun. The sun is called the Aten, and the rays are coming down. And you can see on some of the rays, actually, there is an Egyptian Ankh. And the Egyptian Ankh has to do with the tree of knowledge of good and evil, the Kabbalah. The first thing we're going to start with is the flood. We'll start square one with the flood because we'll say everyone's been wiped out in the world. There's no one except for Shem, Ham, Japheth, their father Noah, his wife, and their wives. That's it. And then the animals. That way, if we start from there, it's going to give us a clean slate working up to the history of sun worship. So Genesis 10, the nations descending from Noah. In Genesis 11, we see the Tower of Babel. So right after they get off of the boat, a couple generations later, the people are trying to challenge the God of the Bible. So it seems like everything was for naught because the world was just flooded and now the people are already going in another direction. So Tower of Babel, we had a king. The king was called Nimrod, and they built this tower, and their languages were divided, and then they were scattered across the earth. So if we start from Noah and we take a look at the lineage going to Abraham, from Noah we go to Shem. Shem is where we get the word Semite. It comes from Shemite. Remember, the Greeks and the Romans could not say the SH sound. They had an SE sound. So Shem turned to Sem. Then we have Afric, Selah, Eber, Peleg, Ru, Surig, Nahor. Now we have the father of Abraham, which is Terah. Remember when we studied Terah during the Bible studies, we found out that Terah was big time into idol worship. As a matter of fact, Terah and Abraham were living in Ur, which is Chaldea, the land of Babylon. And so Terah was basically filling his house with the gods of Babylon and disgracing his son Abraham. And it was because he was affiliated with the king of Babylon, which was King Nimrod. We get down to Abraham. And then Abraham, we deal with him in Genesis 12. If you're doing our Bible studies on Wednesdays, we've already studied this place where Abraham is called out of Haran. And then when he leaves Haran, he makes his way down to the area called Shechem and builds an altar. Just one sec. Let's admit Harry. And then once he builds the altar, eventually he continues into the land of Negev. And then from the land of Negev, he goes into Egypt because there's a famine. Comes back with Lot, who went with him. And he comes back with a ton of different resources because the Pharaoh had tried to sleep with his wife, Sarah, because he pretended his wife was his sister. So he came back with lots of cattle and maidservants and manservants for the Pharaoh, trying to make an apology on behalf of Abraham. And then he makes his way back into Hebron, and the two of them split up. So this is where Lot decides, I'm going to go to Sodom. That was his nephew. And then Abraham decides, well, I'm going to stay close to the oaks of Mamre, and I'll reside there. Abraham is promised the land, but the land that he has promised is land that's already inhabited by the Canaanites. So he's been living amongst the Canaanites. He lived in the land of, he lived near the oaks of Mamre in the land of Shechem, but he lived amongst the Canaanites that were living there. So when we do our Bible studies on Wednesday, we talked about King Shechem and the oaths that they had made to keep peace between themselves. However, the idea wasn't that Abraham was going to occupy a land that was already inhabited. The land was promised to Abraham as being given to Shem at some point. We just haven't seen it yet. So now we're going to take a look coming from Abraham, going to Sarah, Isaac, Rebekah, Jacob, Leah, and then to Levi. We're now going to start with Moses. So we're going a little bit farther down the line from Abraham. Now we're looking at the priesthood. The priesthood show up near the little farther into Genesis, and then obviously once we get into the book of the priest line show up actually a lot later. They show up in Exodus and Leviticus. You're just seeing the birth of them in Exodus, and then you're seeing the duties of the priesthood in Leviticus. And Leviticus comes from Levite, which is where we're getting Levi from. So when we took a look at the Levites, let's go a little bit further. So we went from here, from Abraham down to Leah to Levi, and now we're going from Levi and we're going to go down to Moses. So Levi, we have Kohath and then Amram. Amram is the father of Moses, and Jochebed is the mother of Moses. One thing I'll point out that's interesting is the mother of Moses, Jochebed, that has Yahweh's name right inside of it. So for Moses to be given the name of God, but his mother already having it, you can tell that there is something really strange going on there. And again, that goes back to Genesis 4:26. And this, again, is going to point you towards the sun god. So we see Moses is provided with the name of God in Exodus 3:14. That name is I am. That's Ea Asher Ea. Moses is told God appeared as El Shaddai, not Yahweh. So after Moses is given the name I am that I am, or Ea Asher Ea, God says in Exodus 6:3, to Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob, I appeared as El Shaddai, but I was not known by my name Yahweh or Jehovah. So God clarifies, my name is this, but my name is not that. So if we're looking at that part, it's like it would be quite likely that sun worship might have something to do with that name. It's not to say it's not God's name. It's just that if God doesn't give you a name and other people have it and there's a competing religion, chances are there's a counterfeit. So there's a counterfeiting of God's name being applied to the sun. Moses is giving the 10 commandments, and Moses is giving the design for the Ark of the Covenant. That was that box with the two angels, the two cherubim on it that faced each other. And this is where the Lord would reside amongst his people. And they would carry that box around. The Levites would, everywhere they went. The Israelites wandered for 40 years in the wilderness. So this is the next thing that happens. Moses comes off the mountain. They have the 10 commandments. They have the Ark of the Covenant. We're past this whole thing with the worship of the golden calf. And now they spend 40 years wandering in the wilderness. And the reason they spent 40 years wandering in the wilderness was because the people wouldn't give up their traditions. Their customs and traditions that they had in Egypt, they were ingrained in them. And so what God did was he let the people wander for 40 years in the wilderness so all of the elders would die. Since the elders would not give up their traditions, there was only one method to root out the worship of the sun and the festivals in Egypt from the Israelites, which was let all the elders die in the wilderness, we'll bring all the children out, and they will have no memory of it. Then we go on to the book of Joshua. The book of Joshua is after Moses is dying. So at this point, we're seeing Moses go through Canaan and now conquer this land. So before the land was being shared, now we're seeing a section which is chapters 1 to 12, which is dealing with the conquest of all these different parts of Canaan. So these areas that were being divided amongst the 12 tribes, this is where Joshua is first securing the land. And then the other half of the book of Joshua, this is where basically Joshua is setting up allocations, he's settling the land, he's just basically done the battle part, it's more the administration part. So were there 7 years of battling the book of Joshua, and then there were 18 years of administrating and basically trying to get everything set up because they are now occupying the land for their own usage. So if you take a look, this is how the map looked after Joshua. Actually, this is a little bit later than Joshua because you can see here the kingdom of the north and south is split, where it says the kingdom of Israel and the kingdom of Judah. But what I want to point out is around these different areas, you'll notice that Israel is surrounded by different nations that likely worship different gods. But we have to check that first. So we can see Israel is right against the borders of the Ammonites, right against the borders of the Moabites, and definitely against the borders of Edom. Now, Edom is one of their brothers. That's Esau. Actually, on the left-hand side, too, if you take a look, you can see right here in the red, this is the kingdom of the Philistines. So Israel is surrounded north, east, south, and west by nations that do not know the God of Israel. So it'd be quite likely if they were doing trade with each other that they would maybe adopt some of the practices, traditions, and gods from these other nations. In Genesis 19 to 36 to 38, it says, "So both of Lot's daughters became pregnant by their father. The older daughter had a son, and she named him Moab. He is the father of the Moabites today. The younger daughter also had a son. She is called Ben-Ami. She named him Ben-Ami, sorry. He is the father of the Ammonites today." Okay, so let's go back to our map here. The Ammonites, that's Lot's child. That's from the book of Genesis, that's Ben-Ami. So when Lot slept with his daughter, when his daughters got him drunk, that made this tribe that's sitting right beside Israel called the tribe of Ammon, the Ammonites. When Lot's daughter slept, or when Lot's other daughter slept with him, that led to the Moabites. That's the kingdom directly beneath Ammon, also bordering Israel. So we've got the Moabites and the Ammonites, which are both the children of Lot. He had those two children. And then we had the Edomites. That's Esau's child. Or sorry, that's Isaac's child. If you take a look at these three, though, we don't necessarily know which god they worship just yet, unless you remember the verses I showed you a little bit earlier when we started the presentation. And also, not to forget, there was also influence from the Egyptians. The Egyptians are obviously a little bit farther west, but there was constant warning with Egypt. You would see that in the Old Testament as well. As a matter of fact, once you get to the book of Samuel, you'll find that the only reason that the Israelites wanted a king was because they wanted to have a pharaoh just like the Egyptians had. They wanted someone that would have a bunch of armies and could protect them, and that way they wouldn't have to fear if other nations came to attack. They weren't satisfied that the Lord their God would protect them. They wanted to have the same setup as the other nations. So they needed that security of having a king and also having an army. Did the other nations have gods? So when we looked at Moab, we looked at Ben-Ami, the Ammonites, and we looked at Edom, did they have different gods? Because if they're residing right where Israel is, that might explain where exactly Israel started to worship the Baals, the Ashtaroth, and all these other gods we saw them worshiping. Numbers 21:29. "Woe to you, O Moab! You are destroyed, O people of Shamash. He gave up his sons as refugees and his daughters into captivity to Sihon, king of the Amorites." Okay, so I don't really need to explain the context of what this verse is. The only reason I'm showing this verse is so you can see who the god of Moab is. "O Moab, you are destroyed, O people of Shamash." Shamash was the god of Moab. So if the Israelites were being influenced by Moab, well, then that would mean they would have the god Shamash as one of the possible deities they would venerate, or the customs and practices that they would keep. We're going to do a quick examination of the word Baal. And keep in mind that word Shamash because we'll come back to that. Baal, Thayer's Bible Lexicon. This was the name of the supreme heavenly divinity worshipped by the Semitic nations, the Phoenicians, the Canaanites, the Babylonians, Assyrians, often also by the Israelites themselves and represented by the sun. Okay, so we can see Babylon, Assyria, all these nations that surrounded Israel, they all worship the sun. And then we can see in the Bible lexicon, it also says the Israelites did too. Is that true? Absolutely. We saw that with King Solomon. King Solomon set up these high places for Shamash. So there's proof right there. It's funny how we said, was there any influence coming from the surrounding nations? When we looked at the surrounding nations, one of them we said was the Moabites. And the Moabites are right beside Israel here. And we saw that they worshiped a god that's called Shamash. And then Shamash was a place where Solomon was building high temples, or building high places to in the book of First Kings. We read that a little bit earlier. So yeah, there obviously was influence. So we can see that there was obviously influence coming from the surrounding nations on Israel, and the surrounding influence, at least with some of these nations, was the was the worship of the sun. So if we look at Baal in the Bible lexicon, there's a couple different variations for what the word means. It doesn't always refer to a god. Baal, Strong's Concordance 1166, means to marry or rule over. So when someone is married, it means someone is Baal, right? That would be the word that they would use. So that's one example of how you can use the word Baal, to marry, to rule. Another example of Baal, which again goes with the previous example, is owner or lord. So if you're talking about ruling, right, if you're talking about being on top, then you're talking about owning or lordship. So here we can see Baal is having to do with lordship. So what you would find quite often is when someone was married, you would see the word Baal show up in a sentence, or if someone had a husband, it would be my Baal. My husband is my Baal. We also have this word Beel. Beel shows up a little bit later. If you remember, the Bible was split in the sense that once you reach the last couple books of the Bible, such as Ezra, Nehemiah, and Daniel, I believe, some of those chapters aren't actually written in Hebrew. The rest of the remaining chapters of those books are actually written in Greek. So here, if we take a look at the book of Ezra, we can see in the book of Ezra, the word Baal has been switched to Beel. And all that is just the Greek way of translating the word. So the point of this is we can see all the way back, far, far, far back in the early days of the Torah, we can see that they worshiped the god Baal, or at least they had the word Baal in their language, which means they had already encountered this. And then we can see all the way at the end of the Bible in the book of Ezra, because Ezra and Nehemiah, these are books, Ezra, Nehemiah, and Micah are describing things at the end of the Bible. So we can see pretty much from the first book of the Bible to the very last book of the Old Testament, this word Baal has followed them everywhere. They can't shake it. And we can see that Baal has something to do with the worship of the sun. So we can see that one of the things that has permeated through Israel's history since the very beginning was the worship of the sun. And then here we can see 1168. This is the heathen god. This is Baal as the pagan deity. Now, when you look at the spelling of Baal, it's actually no different in Hebrew. If we're talking about my Lord, or we're talking about being married, or if we're talking about the deity itself, it's actually written the exact same way in Hebrew. So you have to look at the surrounding words to figure out what the context is when you're reading verses about Baal, to figure out, are we talking about someone's husband, or are we talking about the Phoenician god? And just to clarify, when I use the word Phoenician or I use the word Canaanite, they're the exact same thing. Canaanite is the word that's used in the Bible. Phoenician is the word you'll find in your history books. The reason why is because the Greeks called the Canaanites the purple people, and the purple people were called the Punics, and that's exactly what the Romans called them as well. And Punic was coming from Punic Phoenician. So Punic, Phoenician, Canaanite. It's all the same thing. Judges 9:3. And when his mother's brother spoke all these words about him in the presence of all the leaders of Shechem, their hearts were inclined to follow Abimelech, for they said, he is our brother. So they gave him 70 shekels of silver from the temple of Baal Berith, which Abimelech hired some worthless and reckless men to follow him. He went to his father's house in Ophrah, and on one stone murdered his 70 brothers, the sons of Jerubbaal. So if you take a look here, there's two things I'm pointing out. We've got Shechem. Now we know where Shechem is because that's where Abraham used to live. When we do our studies on Wednesdays, Shechem comes up a lot. Jerubbaal, look at the last part of the name. You can see the word Baal in the name. And then if you take a look at the temple is called Baal Berith. So again, we know it's a temple to Baal. So in Shechem, we know for sure they worshiped a god called Baal. And Shechem is a Canaanite area in which Abraham had lived. If we look at Baal Berith means Baal of the covenant. So Berith just means covenant. So Baal of the Berith, it's a Shemite god. People thought at one point that this might have been, a lot of Bible researchers, they thought that Baal Berith was actually the name of the God of Israel. So if you remember back in Genesis, when the king of Shechem had made a covenant with Abraham, they made a covenant in front of the well at Beersheba. This is what scholars thought the name Baal Berith came from. They thought that Baal Berith was the name of what the Shechemite king was relating to the God of Israel after he took his oath with Abraham. I found out, though, that's not the case. So here's Baal Berith. So Baal Berith was worshipped here in Shechem. So this is Shechem. So we're talking Israel where Abraham was. But look what we read in Joshua 13:5. The area of the Gileadites and all Lebanon to the east, from Baal Gad below Mount Hermon to Lebo Hamath. So here we have another place. Now notice here, we've got here Baal Berith. Baal Berith is to the left of the Dead Sea here, near the top, and we could see Shushan. If we go a little bit higher, though, we're going to find another place named after Baal, which is Baal God. And Baal God means ball of fortune. The word Gad means fortune. And you can see that this one is located near Mount Hermon. So Mount Hermon is just a little bit north. So you can tell all this worship of Baal is pretty much situated around the Dead Sea here. He's like a Mesopotamian god that you can see worshipped in places like Assyria, Iraq, Iran, Israel today, going all the way down to Jordan. So what we found, the meaning behind the word Baal from the examples we looked at, is Baal can mean to marry or rule over. It can be used as owner, lord, master, or husband. It's the name of the chief Phoenician Canaanite god. So the Canaanites were polytheists. They had multiple gods, but their chief god was Baal. Areas were named after where the god resided, where temples or idols were named after them, such as the temple of Baal Berith or Baal God Mountain. So in other words, if you remember from the book of Deuteronomy, we mentioned that after what happened at Babylon, it talked about the Lord dividing the nations, and each nation was allotted one of the sons of God. Well, the sons of God, this is what we're seeing here. We're seeing that there's other nations where there's areas where they have gods appointed over specific geographic areas. And that's what we see. Baal Berith, well, Berith is an area. Gad, well, Gad was a mountain. So you're either seeing that people, places, temples, they're being named after deities that were being venerated over that area. As a matter of fact, when you read what the Lord of Hosts, his allotment is, it tells you in the Bible that the God of Jacob, it says Israel is his allotment. So in other words, that area of Jerusalem, that area itself is supposed to be ruled over by God, not some other principality, not some other son of God. While there are gods that are over the other nations and over the geographic areas, Israel itself was allotted to the God of Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob. And we can see that these gods, whether it's Baal God, Baal Berith, or Baal anything, these are all representations of the sun. It's the same thing we saw in Egypt. Where is the word Baal first found in the Bible? A really good way to try to wrap your head around things that are going on in the Bible is find the first time it happened, find the last time it happened, and then try to read all the details. So where's the first time we see the word Baal in the Bible? In Genesis 36, 32 to 38. These are the kings who reigned in the land of Edom before any king reigned over the Israelites. Bela, the son of Beor, reigned in Edom, the name of his city being Dinhabah. Bela died, and Jobab, the son of Zerah of Bozrah, reigned in his place. Jobab died. And Husham, from the land of the Timonites, reigned in his place. Husham died. And Hadad, the son of Bedad, who defeated Midian in the country of Moab, reigned in his place. The name of his city being Avith. Habad died, and Samlah of Masrekah reigned in his place. Samlah died. And Saul of Rehoboth on the Euphrates reigned in his place. Saul died, and Baal-Hanan, the son of Achbor, reigned in his place. Baal-Hanan, the son of Achbor, died, and Hadar reigned in his place. The name of the city being Pau. His wife's name was Methabel, and the daughter of Matred, daughter of Mesab. A lot of people, when they see these verses, they just skim them and read over them because you're not really going to grab anything through it the first time unless you're actually going to study the lineages. But that's what we're doing today. So what we're looking at here in Genesis 36 is Esau, who is Edom. We're looking at the kings that came from his line. And it tells you specifically, Esau had kings before any of the Israelites had kings. So obviously Esau, when he saw the pharaohs and he saw the king of Babylon, he thought to himself, well, why can't my children be rulers just like them? We didn't see this until later with the Israelites, though, until we reached the book of Samuel. Now, in this verse here, we're seeing a list of the different Edomite kings. But what's interesting here is we can see Baal showing up in the list of the Edomite kings. So Esau's lineage is where we first see the name Baal. The first time Baal ever shows up in the Bible is with Edom. And it's really interesting because in the Bible, before those twins were even born, Jacob and Esau, God said, Jacob I loved, Esau I hated. Now, Esau is a child that's not even born yet. You can't hate a child before they've done anything. This was something prophetic. It was talking about the idea that Esau was obviously going to go towards a different direction than the God of his fathers than Jacob would. This is why the God of Israel loved Jacob and hated Esau, because Esau obviously went to worship Baal, whereas Jacob went and continued to worship the God of his fathers. So here we see Baal Hanan, Genesis 36:38. So if you look at the first part of the word, we get the word Baal. So you have to read it from right to left. So we've got 3 letters. Now here's Baal Shanaan in the lexicon. Baal Shanaan means Baal is gracious. Okay, well, if we have a king of Edom and his name is Baal is gracious, it's pretty evident that he worships the god Baal, because he's saying that the sun god Baal is a gracious god. The Edomites worship Baal. This can be seen in the name Baal Hanan, which was the 7th king of Edom. Okay, so we know that the 7th king of Edom worshiped the god Baal, and we know that Baal, for the first time in the Bible, shows up with Edom. Here are the 7 kings of Edom we just read about in Genesis 36. We had Bela, son of Beor. We had Jobab, son of Zerah. We had Husham, from the land of the Temanites. Hadad, son of Bedad. Samlah, from Maskara. Shaul, from Rehoboth. And Baal Hanan, son of Akbor. And then lastly, we have Hadad. And I put an arrow beside Hadad. There was a Canaanite deity. Its full name was Baal Hadad. Now, if you haven't noticed, we had Baal of Beor, we had Baal God, we had Baal Berith, and here we have Baal Hadad. Now, I'd like to point something out here. We have 2 children named Hadad within Esau's bloodline. Did we just take the name Baal and then stick it on the front of one of the children's names, whether it's the 4th son or the last son? I'll point out that the name Hadad is also found amongst the bloodline of the Ishmaelites. Both the Ishmaelites and the Edomites had children in the Bible that were named Hadad. It could have came from either. So Hadad in Mesopotamia. Hadad was a West Semitic god of storms, thunder, and rain. He had a consort, and the consort's name was Atargatis. Hadad was represented as a bearded deity, often holding a club and a thunderbolt and wearing a horned headdress. The bull was symbolic of Hadad. Hadad was identical with the Hittite deity Tishab. And here is Hadad in theophoric personal names. The name Hadad appears by itself as a personal name and is a theophoric element of the names of Hadaram, Hadazer, and a royal title of Ben-Hadad. These names attest to the ongoing cult of Hadad in Syria, as well as a possible local variant of Hadad revered among the Edomites, which we saw. Both Ishmael and Esau had children named Hadad, which is quite likely where the name of the storm god came from. We're going to take a look at the wives of Esau, because in order for us to understand exactly where some of the sun worship pieces came from, we need to explore Esau's lineage more closely. We don't know for sure if Esau is where the start of sun worship came from, but we can see the first time the Baal is mentioned in the Bible, it's definitely connected to the children of Esau. So we're going to look at the wives of Esau. Esau's family history is provided in 3 locations in the Bible. As part of the Jacob narrative in Genesis chapters 26 and 28, in a section on the Edomite kingdoms in Genesis 36, that's actually what we just read a couple seconds ago with the 8 kings, a brief passage that lists his sons but not his wives in 1 Chronicles 1. Now here's the problem. The challenge is that 2 portions of Genesis which names his wives do not appear to agree on who Esau married. So when we take a look at Genesis chapter 26 and 28 and compare it to 36, we're going to have an issue. Genesis 26 and 36 says, when Esau was 40 years old, he married Judith, daughter of Berai the Hittite, and also Basmath, daughter of Elon the Hittite. So here we can see Esau married 2 Canaanite women. He married 2 Hittites. One Hittite was from Beri, the other was from Elon. So 2 wives, Judith and Basmath. Then in Genesis 28, 8-9, it says, Esau then realized how displeasing the Canaanite women were to his father Isaac. So he went to Ishmael and married Mahalath, the sister of Nebaioth, and the daughter of Ishmael, son of Abraham, in addition to the wives he already had. Okay, so we had 2 wives. So he married 2 Canaanites. They were 2 Hittite women. Judith was one, and the other one was Basmith. So we have Judas and Basmith, and now we add another one. The other one is Mahalath. So the first two were Canaanites. He realizes his family's not impressed, and he's like, all right, I'll marry an Ishmaelite because Abraham married Keturah and Hagar. So he now marries Mahalath, which is the daughter of Ishmael. So he figures, all right, well, if my parents are displeased with the Canaanite women and I'm not going to marry within the family, I'll marry within the Ishmaelites. But then we start to see a problem. Genesis 36, 1-3. So this is later. This is the account of the family line of Esau, that is Edom. Edom took his wives from the women of Canaan, Adah, daughter of Elon the Hittite, and Oholibmah, daughter of Anna, and the granddaughter of Zibeon the Hivite. Also Basmith, daughter of Ishmael, the sister of Nebaioth. Okay, serious problems here. Notice here how Elon, so we have Elon the Hittite. Let's go back a couple of verses here. If you look at this one here where it says, Basmith, daughter of Elon the Hittite. So in Genesis 26, we see that Elon the Hittite's daughter is Basmith. But once we get to Genesis 36, we see Elon the Hittite's daughter is Adah. That's a totally different name. Now, if we take a look, we can see the other Canaanite woman is Oholibmah, the daughter of Anna. So when we looked at the other father's name wasn't Anna. So we have this problem here where we're like, okay, are these more wives? Are these two different names for the same woman? You can't tell for sure. And then you can see here it says Basmith, the daughter of Ishmael. I'm like, but I thought we just read in Genesis 28 that he married Mahalath. Is Mahalath the same thing as Basmith? We don't know. So when you compare those verses, obviously a problem arises. We can't figure out whether he has 3 wives or 6 wives. The lineage of Esau, when we do a comparison, this is what we see. We see in Genesis 26-28, the daughter of Beri is Judith, the daughter of Elon is Basmith, but in Genesis 36 it says Adah. We see the daughter of Ishmael is Mahalath, but in Genesis 36 it says Basmith. So here we have 2 Basmiths, one coming from the Hittites, one coming from the Ishmaelites, and we can see between 26 and 36, both the Canaanites and the Ishmaelites, they both seem to have a daughter with the name Basmith, but they're 2 different people. And then we have daughter of Anna, and this one we have no connection to because Anna wasn't mentioned prior. So Genesis 36 lists a different name for the daughter of Elon, Adah instead of Basmith, a different name for the daughter of Ishmael, Basmith instead of Mahalath, and Judith is replaced by a wife from a totally different father. So given these details, Esau could have 3, 4, or 6 wives. Now, we don't necessarily have to get to the bottom of this, but I will show you the 3 different variations of how Esau's wives could lay out based on the information that we're given. And it just gives you some familiarity around Esau because Esau's lineage is the hardest lineage to study in the Bible. I kind of have a feeling, honestly, that today in history, Esau still exists. I know exactly who they are, and they are hiding their lineage for this reason. So you could have 3, 4, or 6 wives. So if we go from Adam and Eve and we go down to Noah and then to Shem, Ham, and Japheth, from there we go to Abraham. Abraham to Sarah, Sarah to Isaac, Isaac, Rebekah, Esau, and now we're looking at the Edomites. We're going to specifically look at Isaac's son Esau and the Edomites. So here are the lineage of Esau if Esau had 6 wives. So if we use the details from Genesis 26, 28, and 36, if we look at each one of those as being a separate wife, this is how that would look. So we have Beri. Beri was mentioned as being from the father of one bloodline. So we have Beri and then Judith. So this is the first one that was mentioned in Genesis 26. Then if we take a look, we have Elon the Hittite. And Elon the Hittite, we saw 2 names, Basmith and Adah. We couldn't tell if they were 2 different people, so we separate them. And then same with Ishmael. We can't tell if Mahalath and Basmith are the same person, so we separate them. And then Anna the father has this daughter Oholibmah. Again, we don't know if Anna is the same as Beri or overlapping with Elon, so we keep them all separated. This is how we get 6. Another way you could look at it, we could say that Basmith under Adah and Basmith under Mahalath, they're the same person, same individual. So perhaps Basmith was some kind of a title or a nickname, and then there was just Adah and Mahalath, and so Esau only had 4 wives. So when we take a look, we know that Jacob had 4 wives, and here we can see Esau potentially could have 4 wives as well. So he's copying his brother Jacob. Then there's the final configuration. The final configuration is that Beri is Anna, and if Beri is Anna, then Judith is also known as Oholibmah. And then we are left with Ada and Bosmith, and then Mahalath and Bosmith. So these are all the possible configurations as to how many wives Esau could have based on the Bible. If you want my expert opinion in regards to how many wives I think Esau had, I'm leaning towards 6. And the reason why I say 6, Jacob stole the blessing from his brother. He also stole the birthright from his brother. The two brothers really were in competition to a certain degree with the love of their father and obviously the love of their God. What I find with Esau is Esau being as competitive as he is in other parts of the Old Testament, it would make a lot of sense to me that Esau, just to kind of one up his brother, would have more wives than his brother. So if his brother had 4 wives, so in other words, he had Leah and he had Rachel and then the 2 concubines, well, it would make sense that Esau would try to one up his brother being the older, and losing the birthright and the blessing, he could at least show off that he has more wives. So he has 6. Again, this isn't something I can confirm, but it's definitely worth something noting. The reason why we're bringing up these bloodlines is because these bloodlines don't necessarily connect with the kings of Edom. You can't actually connect these women to the 8 kingdoms we just looked at. But we know that they came from amongst these women. So we know that for sure the worship of Baal, it either came from Ishmael or it came from the Hittites, because it was specifically 2 Hittite women that Esau had married. So either the Hittites had taught him how to worship Baal, or it was the Ishmaelites who taught him to worship Baal, because Esau grew up knowing the God of Israel. So Esau married both Canaanites, Hittites. So when I say Canaanites, Hittites were the Canaanites he married. So that was a subgroup within the Canaanites. So Esau married both Hittites and Ishmaelites. Did Esau learn the worship of Baal through his wives? Here's an article. It's by the Hebrew University. It's called Baal, the son of Dagon, in search of Baal's double paternity. In this article, it says 2nd millennium BC. So we're talking 2000 BC. Hurrian and Hurro-Hittite texts, whose origin lies primarily in North Syria, portray the Hurrian storm god Tisab as the son of 2 fathers, the gods Kumarbi and Anu. Okay, the reason I'm bringing this up is because this article is talking about the Hittites. And the Hittites, we're trying to figure out what their religion is. And so if we can see 2000 BC, that is around the time in which we saw Esau picking up these other foreign gods. And when he married these women, this was around that timeline. So using this article, if we can figure out who the gods of the Hittites are, well, then we can try to translate this and figure out exactly where did Esau learn to worship the sun? Where did Esau learn to worship Baal? And so we can see the Hittites, the Hurro-Hittites, because the Hurrians were another group of Canaanites, they worshipped a storm god called Tisab. Now, remember Tisab? We saw Tisab just a little bit earlier. I'll bring it up in just a couple minutes. The Hurro-Hittite composition known as the Song of Kumarbi describes how Kumarbi swallowed Anu's member in the course of hostilities between them, thereby conceiving and birthing or giving birth to the storm god Tisab. So you have to know exactly how the religions of the Hittites work to make any sense of this, because these characters are all completely foreign. These words are all very foreign. So I've drawn a diagram to explain it to you. In the Song of Kumarbi, which is one of the texts that brought up this god Tisab, this was written between the 14th and 15th century on this tablet. There was a sky god. The sky god's name was Anu. There was a grain god. The grain god's name was Kumarbi. That's the one on the bottom. And there was Tisab, the storm god. What they had written on this tablet was Anu and Kumarbi. Basically what happened was somehow Anu lost his phallus. His phallus went into the stomach of Kumarbi, and then this created the storm god Tisab. So Tisab is a combination of the heaven and the earth, the grain god and the god of heaven. So you have a male god in heaven and you have a male god on the ground. There's no Mother Earth here. It's just 2 males. So Tisab is the creation of 2 males. There's no women involved. Now Anu is the positive one and Kumarbi is the negative one. So Tisab, he would ally himself with Anu. Anu was his father of preference, and he was looked at as the good father. Kumarbi was the bad father. And so Anu and Tisab would fight against Kumarbi, even though that was his other father. Over time, this myth translated. The Hurrian myth, which affects the Hittites, is the Song of Kumarbi. However, as it went towards the Greek Empire, it was also recorded in Philobiblios, where Anu became known as Uranus. So if you've read about Uranus, that's Greek mythology. All that happened was we converted the sky god Anu into the name Uranus. And then the storm god, instead of Tisab, became Demoris. And then Kumarbi became Dagon or Elis. There was a change over time. And then finally, we have this Ugaritic text. The Ugaritic texts were written between the 13th and 12th century BC, so close to the Hurrian texts. And then Anu was known as the god El. That's the Canaanite god if you look at most of your encyclopedias. That was the chief god of the Canaanites, El. And then in the Bible, we have this name Baal. Baal is a storm god. Well, Baal is no different than Tisab or Demoris. And then lastly, we have the second father, which is Dagon, the grain god. So there wasn't much change between the Ugaritic texts and the text of the Greeks relating to Dagon. What did change, though, was this name Baal. So Tisab, Demoris, Baal are all the same thing. So in other words, the pagan nations, they would teach their children that Baal was the product of both the heavens and the earth coming together, not a male and a female, but two males. The Hurrian Hittites worship Baal as the storm god Tisab. So where did Esau learn how to worship the sun? We know for sure it could have came from the Hittites. Why? Because the storm god Tisab is the same as the storm god Baal, and Baal was first seen in the ranks of the Edomites, and we can see that through Esau married Hittite women. So we know for sure that sun worship, at least in Edom, started with the Hittites, because that's how Esau would have learned it. So the kings of Edom, Bela, son of Beor. The question is, did the first king of Edom worship Baal? We know the last king did. We know the second last did for sure because it's right in the name. But Baal or Baal-Hadad, we can tell the worship of Baal. The sun was there. What about the first one? Bela, son of Beor. Bela and Baal are slightly different. If we look in Genesis 36:32 under Bela, Bela says an Edomite, and it's from Bala, but it says of Beor. Now here's the interesting part. When we look at Beor, Beor shows up in Numbers 31:7-8. Then they waged war against Midian, as the Lord had commanded Moses, and they killed every male. Among the slain were Evi, Rechem, Zur, Hur, and Reba, and the 5 kings of Midian. They also killed Balaam, son of Beor, with the sword. Okay, so this is interesting. Let's go back here for a second. In Genesis 36, Bela is the son of Balaam. So the kings of Edom, the father of Bela of Beor was Balaam, which makes it pretty likely the first king of Edom was a priest of Baal. Because if you know the story of Balaam, Balaam was the one who tried to curse Israel, and he was hired by the Moabite king. So if your father is a priest of Baal and your name is Bela, chances are you're a priest of Baal when your subsequent brothers who are kings are named after Baal and Hadad. Genesis 36:32. So we're looking at the first king again, the first Edomite king. Bela, son of Beor, reigned in Edom. The name of his city was Dinhabah. Okay, so the first Edomite king had a city called Dinhabah. The reason why I bring this up is because a lot of times you'll find that the city names, the name has a meaning that's associated to a god. If we look in the Jewish Encyclopedia from 1901, the Hebrew name Dinhabah may mean a robber's den. This should flick some lights on. Do you remember this image here? This is an image of Christ, and he's in the temple. It was the only time you saw him get angry. He took the table of the money changers and he flipped it over in the temple. Christ in the Bible was always turning the other cheek, but this was the one time in the Bible you actually saw Christ get angry. When there was money and trade happening inside of the temple, this was it. That was the end of it. And Christ flipped the tables over. In Luke 19:46, saying to him, "It is written, my house shall be a house of prayer, but you have made it into a den of robbers." Stop, think about that for a second. The first town of the first Edomite king is named after a den of robbers. And then here we have in Luke 19:46, Christ speaking to the money traders. My house of prayer has become a den of robbers. The question is there an overlap? Because that was a very specific choice of words. We see that choice of words used in Matthew 21:13 and Mark 11:17, which is just another variation of Luke 19:46. But we also see the exact same language in the book of Jeremiah. Jeremiah chapter 7:11 has this house, which bear my name, become a den of robbers in your sight. Yes, I too have seen it, declares the Lord. So now we have two verses. We've got Old Testament, book of Jeremiah, New Testament, book of Luke. And in both cases, God is asking, has my house become a place, a den of robbers? And the word den of robbers is coming from this word Dinhabah. And Dinhabah was the first town that an Edomite king had named in regard, that's the name of the first town of the first Edomite king. And his father was a priest of Baal. There we go. In the book of Jeremiah, the robber's den wording was used in the same paragraph as Baal. Okay, so then the theme in the Bible of robbing and thieves, maybe when you read the Bible, you notice there's verses about robbers and thieves. You might want to associate that to Baal. Because if you look in Jeremiah 7:9-11, it says, will you steal and murder, commit adultery and perjury, burn incense to Baal, and follow other gods that you have not known? And then come and stand before me in this house, which bears my name, and say, we are delivered, so we can continue in all these abominations? Has this house, which bears my name, become a den of robbers in your sight? Yes, I have seen it, declares the Lord. So we can tell here that the people were worshiping the god Baal. They were following completely other gods. And the God of Israel says, are you going to pretend that you're delivered and you're going to go to heaven, right? Because that's what you're reading here. Are you delivered? Are you going to be saved? Are you going to heaven? And you're going to continue to keep up with these abominations? Has this house become a den of robbers? You can tell that there is an association to sun worship and Baal and false worship. Because this is, when you think of a den of robbers, that means you're stealing something. So what exactly is sun worship doing? Sun worship is stealing from the God of Israel. If you're noticing that, sun worship is stealing from the God of Israel. It's the counterfeit. The worship of Baal is associated to the idea of a den of robbers. Dinhabah was also known as Danabah. That's how the Greeks wrote it. Dinhabah. Ptolemy mentions Danabah near Palmyra, Syria, was a later bishop's see. And according to Zosimus, there was a Danabah in Babylonia. Okay, this is interesting. So Danabah was the place named after the first Edomite king, whose father was a priest of Balaam, so he worshipped the god Baal. But the name that they chose for this town, which means robber's den, also showed up in Babylon. And Babylon is where we had the first king of all, which was King Nimrod. And they were doing something in regards to trying to overthrow the heavens, a different form of worship. So now you can start to see there is an overlap between Genesis chapter 11 and the Tower of Babel, and what happened later with the worship of the sun involving Lot, right? Because his children, the Moabites and the Ammonites, they are worshiping the exact same thing that we can see Esau is, and we can see there's connections that go all the way back to Babylon. The first king of Edom, Bela of Beor, is also mentioned in Genesis 14:2. That's the first time you see his name. So we know that this king is a priest of Baal. Genesis 14:2, that these made war with Ber, the king of Sodom, and with Bersha, the king of Gomorrah, Sinab, king of Admah, and Shember, king of Zeboim, and the king of Bela, which is Zor. This is interesting. Zor is Sodom. When we talk about Sodom and Gomorrah, sometimes you'll see the word Sodom, sometimes you'll see the word Zor. When Lot left his uncle Abraham, he left and he went to Zor, and Abraham went to Hebron and Shechem. So Abraham stayed at Mamre and Hebron, and then we had Lot who went to Zor, and we had that story of Sodom and Gomorrah, and then Lot was pulled out of the town. Zor is where Lot was living, the father of Moab and Ben-Ami. So Zor, which is Sodom, remember, Sodom and Gomorrah is where people were living unfairly. There was no morals and values. The word Sodom is where you get the word sodomy. Remember, the angels came to the town, and the people of the town, the men of the town specifically, tried to sodomize the angels because the angels look like men. So when the angels took Lot out of Sodom and Gomorrah, what ended up happening was we learned that his daughters slept with Lot. And so when the daughters slept with Lot, he had two sons. One was Moab and one was Ben-Ami, which is the Ammonites. So these two groups right here that you can see where the arrows are pointing to, we've already proven that both of them were connected to this god called Shamash or Moloch. Those were the names that we had seen, Shamash and Moloch. So this is all coming from Genesis 19:46. Thus both the daughters of Lot became pregnant by their father. The firstborn bore a son and named him Moab. He is the ancestor of the Moabites to this day. The younger also bore a son and named him Ben-Ami. He is the ancestor of the Ammonites this day. Now check this out from Deuteronomy. In Deuteronomy 32:28-32, it says, Israel is a nation devoid of counsel. Okay, so devoid of counsel, it means you're not listening to reason. They have with no understanding among them. If only they were wise, they would understand it, and they would comprehend their fate. How could one man pursue 1,000, or two put 10,000 to flight, unless their rock had sold them, unless their Lord had given them up? For their rock is not like our rock. Even our enemies concede. But their vine is from the vine of Sodom and from the fields of Gomorrah. Okay, this piece is huge. So here we're seeing in Deuteronomy 32, Israel is a nation devoid of counsel. So in other words, we're looking at the first sentence, Israel has no common sense. Why does Israel have no common sense? It says here, the next line, if they were wise, they would comprehend their fate. Or what's their fate? How could one man pursue 1,000 or put 10,000 or two put 10,000 to flight unless the rock had sold them, unless the Lord had given them up? So in other words, the God of Israel, whenever he was with them, they were able to pull off these amazing feats. You would see the surrounding nations be afraid of them. You would see a couple Israelites be able to kill hundreds of foreigners. It was supernatural what happened. And here in Deuteronomy, what God is asking is, could Israel ever be put in the position basically where they're going to be the tail? So could two people scare away 1,000 of Israel? Well, not unless their rock had sold them or unless the Lord had given them up. That's the only way that's going to happen. So Israel always had the advantage. In 31, it says, for their rock is not like our rock. Even our enemies concede. But their vine is from the vine of Sodom and from the fields of Gomorrah. Okay, now we're getting somewhere. So when we take a look at this, what we're seeing is we see the symbol of a rock and we see the symbol of a vine. And we see that the Lord is being compared to a rock in verse 30. And then we can see in verse 31, there is another rock and there is another vine. So again, there is a counterfeit religion that's being described here. And you can see that the vine, the origin of the counterfeit religion, is from Sodom and from the fields of Gomorrah. Did Lot's children worship the sun? Remember, Lot lived in Zor. Zor is Sodom. 1 Kings 11:7. At that time, on a hill east of Jerusalem, Solomon built a high place for Shamash, the abomination of Moab, and for Moloch, the abomination of the Ammonites. Okay, so these are the two sons of Lot. Shamash is one son, Moab is the other. Moab is one son, Ben-Ami is the other. So the Ammonites and the Moabites, these are the two sons of Lot. So Shamash is one god, Moloch is the other god. So yeah, they worship other gods. If we take a look at the encyclopedia, though, and we look at the word Shamash, spelled S-H-A-M-A-S-H, that is an Assyrian Babylonian deity. It is a sun god, but interestingly enough, Shamash has other names. Shamash is also known as Shamosh. Okay, so then Shamash is a sun god. Shamosh is also a sun god. It's the same thing. Sun worship goes all the way back to Sodom and Gomorrah. You can prove that. So let's walk through the steps here. Step number 1, we had to find out where Baal first appeared in the Bible. Where did Baal first appear? In a list of 8 Edomite kings. The seventh king of Edom had the name Baal right inside of his name. When we followed the first Edomite king led us back to a place called Dinhabah, but it also showed us what? It showed us that the first Edomite king was from Zor. Well, where's Zor? Well, Zor is from Sodom. Okay, so then what was the god that Lot worshipped? Well, his sons worshipped Shamash and they worshipped Moloch. And if you do your research, you'll find that Moloch and Shamash are actually the same god, which isn't surprising considering geographically those children were very close to each other, and most importantly, they're brothers. So Shamash and Moloch are the same thing, and Shamash and Moloch were the gods of Moab and the Ammonites. But we also had this group called the Edomites. Edomites also had the same god, except they didn't call it Shamash, they called it Baal. And so whether we look at Edom or we look at Lot, whether we look at Sodom or we look at the Edomites and where they lived, we find that sun worship was occurring in both places. So the fact that Israel would have picked it up from either their brother or Israel would have picked it up from someone else within the family line, it's obviously a very good chance for that, especially when there's other surrounding nations that did it too. So at least if we use the Bible, we can see, according to the Bible, the worship of the sun goes back to Sodom and Gomorrah, because the Bible told us that is where their false vine, that is where their false rock comes from. So moving on, we were taking a look at Jesus Christ, the rock of the church, and the vine, because we read in Deuteronomy 32 said that there was some kind of a counterfeit. It said that there was a rock that isn't like our rock and a vine that isn't our vine. So we have something that's similar to Christ, but it isn't Christ. John 15, 1-4, it says, I am the true vine, and my Father is the gardener. Notice the language. I am the true vine. That means that Christ was aware that there were other vines. There were other deities using his title, but he says, I am the true vine. He cuts off every branch in me that bears no fruit, while every branch that does bear fruit, he prunes so it will be even more fruitful. You are already clean because of the word I have spoken to you. Remain in me as I also remain in you. No branch can bear fruit by itself. It must remain in the vine. Neither can you bear fruit unless you remain in me. When you read this, this should kind of open some ideas in regards to what it means to be in Christ. When we talk about being in the fold of God, or being in the fold of Christ, or being in the body. Just one sec. I'll just wait till Dorothy's audio is connected. Okay, so looking at John 15, 1-4, Christ identifies himself as the true vine. The fact that he says, I'm the true vine, leads you to believe that there's other counterfeit vines. And considering that we saw that in Deuteronomy, it looks like this is obviously carrying right forward to the New Testament. So it says, he cuts off every branch in me that bears no fruit, while every branch that does bear fruit, he prunes so it can be even more fruitful. This actually connects to the parable of the wheat and the tares in the book of Matthew. Because when you think about it, a tree that doesn't bear any fruit, right, that's a tare. That's a tree that has nothing to show, no good works. So we can tell here that the trees that are connected to their vine, or the people that are following the other rock, they're not following Christ, and they're following something that appears to end up with them in the fire. Because when we talk about a branch, if a branch is pulled off a tree, that branch becomes a dry piece of wood. What do you do with a dry stick? A dry stick is used for kindling. That's why you'll find in the Bible, people who practice magic and sorcery, they would use the symbol of the branch, because a witch holds a wand, and a wand is like a dried up stick. And so when you see these passages in the Bible that talk about fruitful, not fruitful, or people who are trees without bearing any fruit, what we're talking about is we're talking about the branch. So we can see that Jesus Christ is the vine in the Bible. He says so in John 15, 1-4. But then in sun worship, we see that there's a vine of Sodom. So we've got two vines in the Bible. We got the vine of Sodom, which is Deuteronomy 32:32, and we've got the vine of Christ, which is John 15, 1-4. So the top true vine and the bottom is the counterfeit. So the true vine and the counterfeit vine, we have to compare them now and take a look at them in regards to rocks, because we had two symbols. One was a vine, one is a rock. So we know that there's a sun god, that's using the symbol of a vine, and there's Christ using the symbol of a vine. Let's look at the symbol of the rock now. In Ezekiel 15, 1-8, actually, I'm going to read one more verse about the vine. The word of the Lord came to me. Now, Ezekiel is an important book because Ezekiel's the one that talks about sun worship in Ezekiel 28, and that the fear would be that in the future, the people that used to follow God would start following the sun. And so now we can see here, it says, the word of the Lord came to me, son of man, how is the wood of a vine different from the branch of any other tree in the forest? Is the wood ever taken from it to make anything useful? Do they make pegs from it to hang things on? And after, is it thrown in the fire as fuel and the fire burns on both ends and chars the middle? Is it then useful for anything? Is it if it was not useful for anything when it was whole, how much less can it be when it was made into something when the fire has burned it and charred it? Therefore, this is what the sovereign Lord says. As I have given the wood of the vine among the trees in the forest as fuel for the fire, so will I treat the people living in Jerusalem. I will set my face against them. Although they will have come out of the fire will yet consume them. And when I set my face against them, you will know that I am the Lord. I will make the land desolate because they have been unfaithful, declares the sovereign Lord. Okay, so when we're looking at what's going on in Ezekiel, we can see that reference to the vine in Deuteronomy is showing up in Ezekiel. Now in Ezekiel, people were worshiping the sun. That shows up in Ezekiel 28. So that's actually just, 13 chapters later. But here we can see the language being used here is, again, talking about wood of a vine and what could you do with the wood, and what could you do with the wood if the wood was burned, if the wood was already useless. What it's talking about is it's talking about the idea of you becoming a new tree. When I was in the Rosicrucians, they had this term called a neophyte. Freemasons, they have the same term. Most occult groups have a term called a neophyte. A neophyte is a new tree. So if you're a new tree, that's probably what this verse is talking about, and the idea of what good can you do, and what good can you do after you pass through the fire. You'll notice that in the Bible, there's a conversation about children being passed through the fire. There's a literal version of that, and there's also a metaphorical version of that. When we talk about the metaphorical version of that, we're talking about the fire in the mind. When people say the roof is on fire, we're talking about thinking. That was the fire in the mind. And so this is what we're referring to here. We're talking about the fire inside of the consciousness. Could a tree with the fire in its consciousness be any more useful before or after it enters that fire? It's talking about false worship. And if the first part's difficult to understand, once you get to verse 6, verse 6 clarifies it. If you didn't get the parable that was being, or the symbol that was being spoken of in the first couple verses, verse 6 confirms to you this has to do with the people of Israel and the fact that they were not being faithful in their worship. And so God turns their back to them. So in other words, if you were able to pick up that the vine in Ezekiel is the same vine from Deuteronomy, you can tell that in Ezekiel, this has to do with the worship of the sun. So what is the thing that God will not put up with? Worship of the sun. He doesn't want you to worship the counterfeit. Ezekiel 8:15-16. This is exactly what I was talking about. So this is actually a few verses back. If you notice here, this is Ezekiel 15. We're talking about wood of a vine different. And then if we take a look over here, a few verses back in Ezekiel 8, it says, Son of man, he said to me, do you see this? Yet you will see even greater abominations than these. So he brought me to the inner court of the house of the Lord. And notice again, the house of the Lord. Remember, when we always see sun worship, where is it always affecting? The house of the Lord. And there at the entrance of the temple of the Lord, between the portico and the altar, were about 25 men with their backs towards the temple of the Lord and their faces towards the east. They were bowing down in the east in worship of the sun. This is the false vine. Now we take a look at the rock. 1 Peter 2:6, for it stands in scripture, behold, I am laying in Zion a stone, a cornerstone, chosen and precious, and whoever believes in him will not be put to shame. So in 1 Peter, who are we referring to? What do you mean believe in a stone? This is a title for Christ. So Christ is the stone, Christ is the rock. In Ephesians 2:20, we get another line that clarifies it. Built on the foundation of the apostles and prophets, Christ Jesus himself being the cornerstone. So Christ is the rock of the church. A cornerstone, if you're a builder, when you build a temple, you make one stone, which is the cornerstone, and then every other stone in the temple is cut off of the cornerstone. So if Christ is the cornerstone and we are disciples, well, as disciples, we are a chip off the old block. We are trying to emulate Christ to the best of our ability so we can be cut the same way as the cornerstone. So Christ will have a certain character, and the Christian disciples will emulate that same character. Matthew 21:42, Jesus said to them, "Have you never read in the scriptures? The stone that the builders rejected has become the cornerstone. This was the Lord's doing, and it was marvelous in our eyes." This is a very important line. Since we know that there's another vine, and that's in Deuteronomy, and we know that vine goes back to sun worship, and we can see that the vine and the rock go together because there's a false vine, which is a false rock. Well, then, who is this other stone? We have a group called the builders. The builders rejected the cornerstone. We know the cornerstone is Christ. So then, if we have Christ being rejected, what's the replacement? Well, the replacement is the Son. And then the second question is, well, who are the builders that rejected Christ and replaced him with the sun in the sky? So the stone the builders rejected, we need to figure out who the builders are. Because if we figure out who the builders are, we might figure out if the worship of the sun is still practiced today in 2020. There is a book called The Builders. It's written by Joseph Fort Newton. And if you notice, it's a story and study of masonry. So who are the builders? Well, the builders are the Freemasons. Once you reach the 3rd degree in Freemasonry, you get this book called The Builders by Joseph Newton. You get it with your Master Mason Lodge book. So we know who the builders are. We know who rejected Christ. So who's following the false vine? Who's following the false rock? The builders. Let's get more details. Let's make absolutely sure. So Freemasons are the builders who rejected the cornerstone. Can we get more detail? Well, Deuteronomy says in 32:28, "For their rock is not like our rock." Okay, well, that would be the builder's rock then. "Even our enemies concede. But their vine is from the vine of Sodom and from the fields of Gomorrah." Okay, so we know that they have a different rock. So they've rejected the chief cornerstone. And they have a vine which isn't Christ, because this vine's from Sodom and Gomorrah. And this vine was from the king of David, and that was in Bethlehem. So we've got two vines. So the vine in Sodom and Gomorrah, we already figured out what it is, because in Sodom and Gomorrah, we know that Lot's children went on to worship Shamash and Moloch, which are the sun. So then we can see that the vine is the sun, and the rock is also alluding to the sun. If we take a look at Baal and Baal worship in the Jewish Encyclopedia, it says, "The question as to the origin of Baal among the Hebrews can only be settled by tracing it among the Semites in general, especially among the Babylonians. Here the name Baal is one of the earliest and most honored national deities." Okay, so before we had the Tower of Babel, this is when we're talking about here, where we have Bel, one of the most honored Babylonian deities, and he's a sun god. Bel was the special god of Nippur, perhaps the oldest of the Babylonian cities. Nippur was the earliest known times a religious center, and the prestige of Bel was so great that when the city of Babylon became supreme, his name was imposed upon that of Merodach, the patron deity of the capital, who was henceforth known as Bel Merodach, or simply Bel. So here we see Baal or Bel are the same thing, and the same way we saw Baal Gad or Baal Berith, which were Baals of certain areas. Now we see Bel Merodach, and Merodach was a person in Babylon, so we're again naming an area after a deity. So that means that there would be a temple of Bel in the area of Merodach, which is named after an individual named Merodach. If we take a look here, this image that comes directly from the encyclopedia, Jewish encyclopedia, this is a pillar of Baal on the right-hand side. So we see it looks like a man's face, and then he's got rays of the sun extending from his head. If we take a look on the left-hand side, that's the compass and square of Freemasonry, and in the center of the compass and square is a sun with a face, like a man. These are Masonic gravestones. On the left is a Masonic gravestone. You see it's a pillar, and then you can see the compass and square. On the right-hand side, we can see Richard Cox, again, a pillar, and we see the compass and square. This is Egypt. This is Asmala obelisk. Now, just to put things into context, this is from the city of On. So this is Heliopolis. This is where the god Ra and Helios was worshipped, which was the sun god that we started with. Well, that's the exact same thing they put on top of their graves. Remember, Heliopolis was also known as Pillar City, City of the Sun. Here is a Masonic Bible. So we can see this young man joining the Masonic order. He's in what looks like military regalia, and you can see that he's been given a copy of his Masonic Bible. Masonic Bible is just simply a King James Bible. It's a King James Bible with extra content in it at the beginning as well as in the end. If you look near the beginning, I looked up the word east and their definitions and what the purpose of the cardinal point east was. Why is the east regarded more sacred than any other cardinal point? So in Masonry, apparently they have to place inside their Bible that the east is so important, they got to place it before the Bible actually starts. And it says, in all ancient mysteries, the east was regarded as peculiarly sacred. As the cardinal point of the sun rising, it was considered symbolic of light, not only by the sun worshippers, but those more enlightened religious intelligence. Hence, the east is the seat of the high officer of the Masonic Lodge, the worshipful master. Lodge halls or rooms are oblong from east to west. Candidates travel from the west to the east in search of light. Okay. When we look at Ezekiel 8:15, look at the very last line. Men with their backs to the temple of the Lord and their faces towards the east. They were bowing to the east in worship of the sun. What we just read here was referring to the ancient mysteries. Unless you can tell me that the Bible is part of the ancient mysteries, the Bible probably doesn't care about facing the east because the ancient mysteries in the Bible are completely at odds with each other. So here what we're seeing is Masonry seems to be in opposition with the Bible. How are we able to tell? Option number one is, first off, we've got these Masonic obelisks. The obelisk is a symbol that came from Heliopolis. Now, Heliopolis and the obelisk, this symbol was supposed to be the phallus of the sun god Ra. Have no other gods before me. You cannot have yourself buried under a symbol of the sun god Ra. And it's not like you haven't seen this just on graves. I know you've seen this at city centers. If you go downtown, most places where there's a town square, you will see the setup, and there's a reason. So if we take a look here and we compare, on the left, we've got the Masonic Lodge. On the right, we've got the Tabernacle of Moses. And apparently, amongst all the millions of Masons across the world, no one seems to notice that the lodge is set up backwards, unless that's done intentionally. So in the biblical temple, you face God in the west. So you come in from the east where the entrance gate is. We can see that over here on the far right. And then on the far west, you have the holiest of holies. But when we look at the Masonic temple, we see the Masonic temple is totally backwards. Instead of God sitting in the area where everyone is facing, we have someone called the worshipful master sitting in the area where everyone is facing. So then God has been substituted by a man, and that man sits in the east instead of sitting in the west. There's a book called Freemasonry and Judaism, The Secret Powers Behind the Revolution. This is a book written by Vicomte Leon de Pons. Basically, it's just showing the connection that without Judaism, there would be no such thing as Freemasonry, because that's what it is. As a matter of fact, in the 1920s, there was a rabbi named Isaac Meyer Wise. He published this in the New York Tribune in 1920, and the quote was, "Freemasonry is a Jewish establishment whose history, grades, official appointments, passwords, and explanations are Jewish from beginning to end." If that was the case, then I could open up the Old Testament and I could read through the Torah, I could read through the Tanakh, and I could understand Freemasonry. But that's not what Masonry is. You see, Judaism is not following the Torah. It's not following the Tanakh. Judaism is either a combination of sun worship or moon worship. So we have to figure out which of the two is this. If we take a look in Israel, we can see two pillars. We see the pyramid just like in Egypt. It sounds like they've picked up this Baal worship, and Baal worship obviously entered Freemasonry. It was taught by Judaism. It's like, well, why would Jews be teaching about a different God? If you remember from the very beginning of the presentation, the Jews had worshipped over we saw 7 different nations of gods that the Jews had worshipped. Imagine a history where the Jews hadn't stopped worshiping the sun god. Imagine a history where the Jews never stopped worshiping the moon god. What would that look like today? Would that look like there's a separate divide within Judaism? Could that look like there'd be Christians and Jews and they'd be separate because one side was obviously following a practice that was an apostate practice they had figured out when they were split from their brothers? Quite possibly, because these symbols are not coming from Israel. These symbols have no connection to Jacob, David, Isaac, or any of the patriarchs. If we take a look, that all-seeing eye, we see it on the money as well. As a matter of fact, this building here, this building is the Supreme Court of Israel. If you look at the top of the Supreme Court of Israel, first off, it's got some really interesting architecture. But secondly, it's got a pyramid with an all-seeing eye on the top of it. Now, that pyramid with the all-seeing eye is identical to what's on the money. Now, this over here, this is an obelisk, and this obelisk, we're looking at the city of London. This is Cleopatra's Needle. Now, in London, London is a city-state. London is separate from the rest of England. The city of London is its own separate city-state. It's just like Vatican City. It's its own separate city-state. And there's one other place in the world that's its own separate city-state. It's not part of the rest of the country that it's in. So first off, City of London. Secondly, Vatican City. The third one to make up the Trinity, that is Washington, D.C. Washington, D.C. is not a part of the United States. It is separate. It is legally different. So we have 3 city-states and 3 city-states, all with 3 obelisks from Egypt. How very interesting. What are the odds of that? The only 3 places aren't part of their country, and they all have places, chunks of Egypt with them. So here's Cleopatra's Needle. This you can find the city of London. There's no question this is Egyptian because you can see the hieroglyphics on it. They actually moved this from Egypt to London, and we know that the city of London is where Freemasonry opened up their first lodge in 1717. This is the Washington Monument. The Washington Monument, again, it's an obelisk, and this is constructed, not moved from Egypt, but constructed after the obelisks in Egypt. As a matter of fact, if you go inside the Washington Monument, you will see the sun disk of Egypt. Again, it's called the sun disk. So if it's a sun disk, that means you have a solar god. And if you take a look, you'll see here's George Washington, and then above his head in the Washington Monument, the same symbol we see in Egypt with the 2 serpents and the sun and the wings. And if you notice here, you've got that 6-pointed star. Isn't that the Star of Judaism? So again, what exactly did Judaism intermix with in order to come out with this new apostate version of worship? It was obviously the worship of the sun, because the same symbols we see in Israel are the same symbols we see in Egypt, which are the same symbols that we see all over the place, actually, which go back to this worship of the sun. If we go to Vatican, the Vatican's no different. This pillar came directly from Egypt. So here's another pillar that's taken from Egypt. Here's the thing that I don't understand. If I'm supposed to be dealing with a church that's representing Christ and his apostles and his disciples, my question is this: why haven't they gotten rid of all the old Roman and Greek gods? Why haven't they gotten rid of the obelisk? Why is there so much pagan iconography that surrounds the Vatican? As a matter of fact, during the French Revolution, we saw the same thing. When the French revolted from the church, looks like there was a secret victory here that was a religious victory. Because we can see here the same religious symbol that appears inside of the churches and inside of Freemasonry. It's appearing above these declarations, which had to do with removing the 10 Commandments and converting all the churches into Temple de la Raison. The French wanted to get the church outside of, they want to get the church out of France. And so what they did was they basically converted all of the former Catholic churches into Temple de la Raison. But interestingly enough, you can see that religion obviously won, because this symbol of the all-seeing eye, which is a religious symbol that goes all the way back to Egypt, this showed up during the time of the French Revolution. So clearly the French people, they might have removed themselves from one religion, but they've bound themselves to another one without even knowing it. We see that same symbol on the money. So French Revolution, we're looking back at the 1700s, but now here we are, hundreds of years later, they still bring that symbol forward. You would think that we'd all be dressed up, or you'd think that we'd all have Egyptian ancestors and relatives, because whether we look at Israel, whether we look at the money, whether we look in the churches, what are we seeing? Egyptian symbolism. There's the Masonic compass and square. Again, we can tell that that symbol that appears on the money obviously has something to do with Masonry, because that all-seeing eye with the blast is in the background. Now, that blast in the background is actually a symbol of the sun. If you remember from our alchemy lessons, when you have a triangle that's facing upwards, it's the symbol for fire. So even without those rays of the sun behind it, we already know from our knowledge of alchemy that that symbol with the eye is a symbol for the sun. And then here's an example inside of the church. Now, the Catholic Church didn't build their own cathedrals. It was the Freemasons that built the Catholic cathedrals. The most beautiful cathedrals across all of Europe were built by the Templars. They were the ones who knew how to build like that. And if you notice here in the decor, again, we see this all-seeing eye. Now, the only place we can find the all-seeing eye pointing us back to is Baal. And here we can see a picture of what looks like Christ, but above his head. Again, we see the all-seeing eye in the sun. This is not Christ. This is the pagan sun god. This is the counterfeit. This is the false vine. This is the rock that is not like our rock. And again, it's on top of the Supreme Court of Israel. The reason why I showed that second picture of the Supreme Court of Israel is because if you do your research, you'll find out in the 1980s, the Supreme Court of Israel made the decision that if you were a Messianic Jew, you couldn't be given free travel and I can't remember what the word was, refuge. Basically what happened was after Israel became Israel in the 40s, late 40s, you had all these people moving back to Israel. So Canada and Germany and the United States, they were all trying to help people get back because basically like gypsies, they were scattered across the earth and they were trying to get back and have their own land. That was what the argument was. And so people were given basically free passage and funding to make their way back to Israel. But in the late 80s, this exact Supreme Court, they passed a decision that if you were a Messianic Jew, meaning you were a Jew that believed that Christ was the Messiah, they would not give you free passage. So that means if you practice and you say, I am practicing Judaism, and Judaism means that I read the Old Testament, maybe I read the Torah and the Tanakh, but I can't touch the New Testament, or I don't read the New Testament, or I read the Torah and I read the Talmud. Basically, any combination of Talmud and Torah would be acceptable. The only thing that wasn't acceptable to get this free refuge would be as if you identified as Jews for Christ, which are the Messianic Jews. So again, once you look at these symbols and you start to see these symbols are appearing where they're pushing back against the Christian belief system, you have to understand that if the Bible tells you there's an antichrist and there's a group that's pushing against Christ, that means it's an antichrist. It's not a matter of offending a group of people. It just says if you are for Christ, you are a Christian. If you are against Christ, you're an antichrist. It's as simple as that. It has nothing to do with demonic possession or people's heads spinning around. It's either you accept it or you don't. I mean, you have friends and family that are antichrist. It doesn't mean that they're bad people. It just means they've rejected God. So here, if you take a look, you can see the Israeli Supreme Court, which has symbols that go all the way back to Heliopolis. They're the ones who stopped Jews from coming back to Jerusalem if they accepted Christ. That should mean a lot. This is also from the Masonic Bible. I'm going to read you this chunk on the cornerstone so you understand what the cornerstone means to them, because if they've rejected the cornerstone for a different cornerstone, maybe within the Masonic Bible we can get some details for what that is. We already know it's the sun, but let's just see if we can get something from here. So it says, what is the symbolism of the cornerstone in masonry? This is a stone which is placed at the corner of the two walls in a building and is considered by operative masons as the most important stone in the edifice. Okay, so in the Bible, cornerstone's most important, it's Christ. Masons, most important stone is the cornerstone. In Masonic buildings, it is now required that the stone be placed in the northeast corner. It is also preferred that this be the location in the public building where masons are asked to perform the ceremony of the laying of the cornerstone. Among the ancients, the cornerstone of important edifices was laid with impressive ceremonies. The preliminaries consisted of a procession of dignitaries encompassing the ground on which the building was to be erected, and consecrating the stone by libations of living water. A solemn prayer of dedication was offered. In the ceremony of laying the cornerstone, the overseer of the building laid his hand upon the adornments of the stone, and also on the ropes with which it was drawn in its position. Then the dignitaries taking part in the ceremony, joined by the appointed citizens, all acted in united effort and with demonstrations of joy laid hope up to the ropes and swung the ponderous stone to its resting place. Then followed the cementing of the stone in its place by operative masons with certain appropriate ceremonies fitting for the type of building to be erected. Okay, so all we're hearing here is how the stone was basically placed, where it was placed, but we're not getting the meaning yet. Then it says, the symbolism of the cornerstone, when duly laid by Masonic rites, is full of significance, which refer to its form, its situation, its permanence, and its consecration. As to its form, it must be perfectly square on its surfaces, and its solid contents a cube. The square is a symbol of morality and the cube of truth. The situation at the corner of the north and east, and the north representing darkness and the east representing light. There we go, right here. So north would be above your head, really, when you think about it in regards to, instead of cardinal directions, north being up and south being down. Notice here we've got east. Again, east is the most important. The situation at the corner of the north and the east, the north representing the darkness and the east representing the light, presents the symbol of Masonic progress from darkness to light and from ignorance to knowledge. The cornerstone is supposed to be of a more permanent and durable quality than any other part of the building, lasting beyond the decay and ruin of the building, and therefore reminding the mason that when the earthly tabernacle of his shall pass away, he has with him a sure foundation of eternal life, a cornerstone of immortality, emanating from the divine spirit, and which will survive the tomb, returning to the creator and the God. Okay, you can stop right there. As soon as you get those last couple sentences, you already know there is no Jesus Christ in this equation. They've replaced him. So now the cornerstone becomes a symbol of your own immortality. So this points us back to the sun, universal deity. Again, I got this off of the CIA's website. Obviously, if the CIA is going to hold information about sun worship, there must be a lot of information in Earth's history that has to do with the worship of the sun, where they think it's so important they need to put it on their website. I'm just going to skim to the bottom here. So we know that people worship the sun as a supreme deity, but I'm going to read the bottom piece here where we just look at some of the names. His beneficent influences cause his identification with the principle of good. Now, remember, when we were looking at this god Teshub, Teshub was the god that we saw in Mesopotamia, and he had two fathers. He had a sky father called Anu, and he had a ground father called Kumarbi. And then over time, it became El, and then Baal, and then Dagon. That's how it translated over hundreds of years. So if we take a look here, it says, his beneficent influences. So when we're reading here about these different sun gods, we're only reading about the top half. You see there's a sky father and there's a ground dad. Well, we're not hearing about ground dad here. Listen, we have the principle of good, the Brahma of the Hindus, the Mithra of the Persians. Remember when we studied Christmas? Remember how much Mithra showed up both before and after Christmas? And same with Sunday. Sunday showed up after, right? So first we had Christmas becoming an official holiday. We had a temple of Mithra dedicated in 274 AD. And then following that, we had Christmas become an official holiday in 350, hundreds of years after Christ. And then here it says, and Athom, and Amun, Pitha, Osiris of the Egyptians, the Bel of the Chaldeans, the Adonai of the Phoenicians, the Adonis, the Apollo of the Greeks, became the personifications of the sun. So we can add to that list. We covered Helios. Apollo we've been seeing quite a bit, actually. Apollo or Apollyon shows up in Revelation 9:11. It's very clear who Satan is. If you're trying to figure out who Satan is in the Bible, look no farther than for different names of the sun, whether it be Jupiter, because as a matter of fact, if we take a look, we had Bel Jupiter. Bel Jupiter was another name of a ball, and Jupiter was Zeus. And Zeus shows up in Revelation 13 when it talks about the church of Pergamum when Christ identifies Satan himself. And then if we take a look at the Royal Archmasons, we've looked at this before, but if you keep seeing this, it's going to start ringing a bell that obviously the people who founded your country have a very different depiction of who God is than the rest of us. So if you're starting to figure out, I wonder where all the statutory holidays come from, look no further. If you have a group of people that worship the sun, and then they found your country, and their books say to this day they still worship the sun, then most of your statutory holidays are probably going to be based off of either the worship of the sun or something pertaining to their rituals. So if we look here, Royal Arch degree, Royal Arch of the 7th degree. So the Mason in the Royal Arch degree gets the name of God. And the name of God, they're given in 3 names. The name is Jah, Be, Lun. Now the centerpiece there that's spelled B-U-H, in some translations you actually see where it says Baal. So it'll say Jah, Baal, Lun. So here it actually says this. It says, the ineffable name in India was Aum, which in its triliteral form. So in other words, in India, when you would hear all the people go Aum when they would meditate, that is a 3-part name. It's A, U, M. There's 3 things you're hearing there, 3 sounds. This Aum name was significant of the creative, the preservative, and the destroying power that is Brahma, Vishnu, and Shiva. So Brahma, Vishnu, and Shiva, well, these are Indian gods. And if we take a look, we have Brahma is the creator. We have Vishnu is the preserver. and Shiva is the destroyer. Jehovah, a varieties of the sacred name, was used among the nations of the earth. 3 particularly merit the attention of the Royal Archmasons. Jah, the name of God found in the 68th Psalm. Baal or Bel. This word signifies Lord, Master, or Possessor, and hence it was applied to many nations of the East to denote the Lord of all things and the Master of the world. Okay, so we are clearly talking about the Baal of Babylon. We're talking about the Baal that was worshipped in Egypt by the symbol of the golden cow here. There's no disconnect. Then we see On. This was the name by which Jehovah was worshipped among the Egyptians. There it is, nail in the coffin. If the people came on the Exodus out of Egypt and they put up a golden calf, well, the part that we were missing was in Exodus 1:11, they also built the Egyptian city of On. The Egyptian city of On is where Jehovah was worshipped among the Egyptians, which means this is where the sun god was worshipped amongst the Egyptians. Remember, Jehovah was the name that was not given by God. So if the Egyptians are using the name Jehovah, well, that would mean what? It means they got it from somewhere else, which means that this connects Genesis 4:26. It says, I have made these remarks on these names of God in Chaldaic, Syriac, and Egyptian, Baal, Jah, and on the expectation that my royal arch companions will readily recognize them in a corrupted form. So in other words, if Masons see these names, Baal, Jah, On, scrambled and not the right form, they know how to take it, put it in the right direction, because of course, in the Royal Arch degree, they teach you the name of God. So that way you know how to say the 3 triliteral name of this god, Aum from India. And again, since this is an Indian god, and notice here what it says the ineffable name in India was Aum. That's the first part of the sentence. Look what it says here. This is in Mystic Masonry. Again, it will be urged that no other name under heaven or amongst men where be saved. Again, it will be urged, there is no other name given under heaven or amongst men whereby ye can be saved. So we're talking about Christ here, or at least that's what that verse is talking about. The book says, but this is the ineffable name which every master is to possess and become, and salvation and perfection are synonymous. It has also been shown that every act in the drama of the life of Jesus and every other quality assigned to Christ is to be found in the life of Krishna, in the legend of all the sun gods from the remotest antiquity. So is there any way to deny that Masonry and sun worship are the same thing? Absolutely not. You've seen way too much evidence of it. We can see that sun worship started all the way back in Sodom and Gomorrah, but somehow Masonry has been able to bring it forward and preserve it this far in the future. So Sodom and Gomorrah, the same practices that were happening, they got pulled forward today through these ancient lodges of not just Masonry, but it's Masonry, it's the Rosicrucians, there's the Theosophists, the Order of the Golden Dawn. There are too many pagan orders to list, but these things were preserved thousands of years. And this brings us to our last point, which is, who is Yahweh? So Yahweh was the name that God never gave his people, but somehow they had. So God didn't say, excuse me, that's not my name. He said, that's my name, but I didn't give it to you. So did other people worship Yahweh? Well, we saw they did in Egypt. The Masonic books record that Yahweh was the name of a god in Egypt. And then here we can see an image of a drachma from the 4th century on the left-hand side, and it's supposed to be Yahweh seated on a wheeled sun throne. Well, God isn't seated on a sun throne. So here what you're seeing is that the Lord of Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob, who we find out is Jesus in the New Testament, he is now being exchanged. He's being substituted with some other kind of God in the Old Testament, which you can clearly tell is the sun. There's been books written on it. For example, Yahweh and the Sun, biblical and archaeological evidence for sun worship in ancient Israel. We've already proven that. We don't need this book. We've already seen lots of it. There's also a group called the Shashu of Yahweh. The reason why the Shashu of Yahweh are really interesting is because the first time that Yahweh's name was ever written down and found anywhere, it was found in an Egyptian text. And when you research who the Shashu Yahweh are, the Shashu Yahweh are Edomites. Now, we found that there were 2 people that were worshiping the sun in the Old Testament. Number 1, Edom. The first place in the Bible we found that anyone worshiped the sun was the 7th king of Edom. And then we also saw that Edom, what did he do? He married Canaanite wives. He married Hittites. So we know that Edom knew about the sun worship deal, but we also see that Egypt did as well. And then if we take a look at the Vox Latina, which we've looked at before, how far into the future did this go? Very far. Because if we take a look at the word Jove, Jove, we know, is the Greek god Zeus. The Greek god Zeus is the Roman god Jupiter. The Roman god Jupiter was being worshipped around the times of Christ. And we can see that Jovi is actually pronounced Yahweh. So Yahweh, what they did was they took the letters YHWH, they injected the letters A for Adonai and E for Elohim. But here's the problem. Adonai was a sun god. As a matter of fact, if we go back and we take a look on the CIA's website right here, see this? We have Atum, Amun, Pitha, Osiris, Egyptians, Bel the Chaldeans, the Adonai of the Phoenicians. So Adonai, Adonis, it doesn't matter where you want to say the A came from, you're still in a rough spot because you understand that the A inside of Yahweh came from the name Adonis, but Adonis is coming from a sun god. So the name Yahweh is built off of the vowels of a sun god. And so it shouldn't be any surprise that Zeus or Jupiter is exactly where we're getting this word Jehovah from. So Satan has counterfeited God, or in this case, Christ as the Lord, by using the symbol of the sun and replacing it with symbols like Zeus and Jupiter and Adonis and Bel and Belus, and the list goes on. Both Jupiter and Isis are gods and goddesses of 1,000 names. If you go through the ancient world, you'll see that, for example, if we do the goddess, Aphrodite is one of her names. Another name that she would go by would be Venus. That was what the names the Romans used. Ishtar was another name that she used. She was in the Bible. She was called Asherah. Today, we're only dealing with sun worship. We still have yet to look at moon worship, because in the Bible, you'll find that there were places that were named after Baal, and there were places that were named after a god called Yah or Yerik. And Yerik or Yah is where you're getting all the lunar names from. So for example, when we talk about a place called Jericho, Jericho was the place in the Bible where the people walked around it 7 times, blew a horn, the walls fell, and they overtook it. Well, Jericho gets its name from a moon god. So we've only looked at the sun god, and that's only half of the equation. We still have to look at the lunar deity to get the other half of the equation. So Jove is the sky god with the sun god. Why? Because the sun is in the sky. And so when we look at Freemasonry, this triangle with an eye that we see on the top, that's the symbol of their deity. It ended up on our money. And so again, when you take a look at the practices that we do, the customs and traditions that we have in this land, any of the lands that they're running will notice that their symbols show up and also their holy days, because most of the holy days we practice today, they're all Celtic. You'd think you're Irish if you're living in North America, because most of the holy days you're keeping actually came from the Celts. And the Celts in the Bible were the Galatians, and the Galatians as well worship the sun god. So now you can see why there's an overlap between the Celts, the Galatians, and the Masons. And then if we take a look to finish off with the Roman cult of Mithra, remember we said that there was a Baal Hadad, we saw there was a Baal God, there was a Baal Berith. Well, here we've got a Baal Jupiter. Jupiter Dolentius was also known as Baal Jupiter. And notice what Jupiter Dolentius' symbol is. Jupiter Dolentius' symbol is a triangle. Where have we seen that before? Every single time we see people worshiping the sun. You can pretty much take the symbol of the triangle and connect it synonymously with the sun, and you'll be right in probably majority of all cases you're looking at symbolism. So here it says, almost all Mithraea contain statues dedicated to gods of other cults, and it is common to find inscriptions dedicated to Mithras and other sanctuaries, especially those of Jupiter. Now, we said that Mithra was a sun god, and we can see that Jupiter is a sun god, and we can see the same areas people are worshiping Mithra, they were also worshiping Jupiter. And we can see here that it says civic religion. The civil religion is a concept that originated in French political thought and became a major topic for American sociologists since its use by Robert Bellah in 1960. So what's the civic religion? It means the implicit religious values of a nation as expressed through public rites, symbols such as the national flag, ceremonies on sacred days, and at sacred places such as monuments, battlefields, and cemeteries. You notice when you go out for New Year's or you go out for Canada Day, you have to go to a certain spot. That's the civil religion. And if you notice in front of all your government buildings, what symbol do you notice? Would that be an Egyptian obelisk? So isn't it kind of interesting how the nations of the land have Egyptian symbols, but they also have Egyptian ceremonies, and that's the civil religion? You'd think you're living in Egypt today. Jupiter Dolentius was a Roman god whose mystery cult, notice, it wasn't a cult that the people necessarily understood. It's a mystery cult because people didn't even know half the time that they were participating. It was widespread in the Roman Empire from the 2nd century to the 3rd century AD. Hey, that's around the time that we did what? Coin Christmas. Like other figures, the mystery cults, Jupiter de Lentius, one of the so-called Oriental gods. How could Jupiter, a Greek god, be an Oriental god? Well, didn't we notice when we were studying the god Hadad? We saw how the god Kadad, which was a Mesopotamian god, eventually made its way into Asia. But this god Hadad, when we looked at it from a Hindu standpoint, it was the god Indra. And Indra actually came from Iran. So here, the Romans are thinking that they're getting Oriental gods, but the Oriental gods came from Iran first. So you could say the Mesopotamian gods went to the Orient, and then from the Orient, they came back into Europe, and that's why they looked at them as Oriental gods. That is why Roman reinventions of ostensibly foreign figures in order to give their cults legitimacy and distinguish them from the cults of the traditional Roman gods. Reinvented or not, the Roman cult appears to have been informed by Baal's roles as the national god and king god. So we can say for sure, during the times of Christ, he might have had different names, but who was the chief god of Rome? You might have called him Jupiter, but who was he actually? Baal. And how long did we see Baal going on for in the Old Testament? Well, we tracked him back to Sodom and Gomorrah today. So we can see that the religion that was practiced in Rome actually came from Sodom and Gomorrah. So when people ask me, oh, like, are these customs and traditions a big deal? I'm like, they might be. I mean, if you look at what happened in the Old Testament, it said that there were 2 vines and that there were 2 rocks. And when it was talking about people being blotted out of heaven, it talked about people being blotted out of heaven because they were involved in false worship. So I think in the book of Revelations, if you take a look, you'll find that one of the big topics that's being discussed in the end times is worship, whether people are doing the appropriate type of worship. And the reason you can tell that is because you see the angels in the book of Revelation say, come out of Babylon, my people, come out of her. What is that referring to? It's mean you live in this world, but you don't have to do the same things that the people in the world do. Be in the world, not of the world. In other words, the people of the church, Christ's disciples, at some point, Christ's disciples are going to figure this out. They're going to look at the Bible, they're going to look at the history, and they're going to realize, my goodness, we've all been tricked into worshiping the sun. How did it happen? Well, we had leaders and kings and rulers all throughout time, going all the way back thousands of years. And what did they all do? They all get involved in the worship of the sun. We saw it in Rome. We saw it in Israel. We saw it in Syria. We saw it in all the surrounding areas. And then we see it right present day to Freemasonry. And so that's why you have people still operating under the civil religion of Rome. And if you actually examine the rituals that we do today, and we compare them to the rituals that they used to do in Rome, you can totally tell where they came from. So sun worship is sneaky. And remember, if you take a look at Genesis 3, the serpent was the serpent was the subtlest beast of the field. Well, subtle means you're not going to notice it. So if the serpent was associated to the sun, that means that if you were looking for the solar religion, guess what? It's going to be a very subtle find. So I'm going to finish this with Jesus is not the sun.
For our struggle is not against flesh and blood, but against the rulers, against the authorities, against the powers of the dark world, and against the spiritual forces of evil in the heavenly realms. Brothers and sisters, the sword is coming. If you hear the watchman's call, please repent and seek out Jesus Christ. There is still time. That at the name of Jesus, every knee shall bow.